Everyone talks about summer like it's supposed to be carefree. But if this season brings up money stress, body stress, family stress, or social stress, that's real too. Growth therapy can help with that. Whether it's your first time in therapy or your 50th, Grow makes it easier to find a therapist who fits you, not the other way around. They connect you with thousands of independent licensed therapists across the U.S., offering both virtual and in-person visits, nights and weekends. You can search by what matters, like insurance, specialty, identity, or availability, and get started in as little as 2 days. And if something comes up, you can cancel up to 24 hours in advance at no cost. There are no subscriptions, no long-term commitments. You just pay per session. Grow helps you find therapy on your time. Whatever challenges you're facing, Grow Therapy is here to help. Grow accepts over 100 insurance plans, including Medicaid in some states. Sessions average about $21 with insurance, and some pay as little as $0 depending on their plan. Visit growtherapy.com/booknow to get started. That's growtherapy.com/booknow. growtherapy.com/booknow. Availability and coverage by state and insurance plan.
Hey listeners, this is Peter and welcome back to the History Shorts. Today's episode is brought to you by the Podcast Republic, your ultimate listening app. Discover and subscribe to thousands of podcasts from around the world. Download Podcast Republic today, available on Google Play and the Apple App Store. Today on History Shorts. On October 27th, 1962, the most dangerous day of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a Soviet submarine sat on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, surrounded by American warships. It had been submerged for days. Its batteries were nearly dead. The temperature inside had reached over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Carbon dioxide levels were rising to the point that crew members were losing consciousness. The captain believed war had already begun. The political officer agreed. They wanted to launch their nuclear torpedo. To do so required the agreement of a third officer, the brigade commander aboard the submarine. His name was Vasili Alexandrovich Arkhipov, and he said no. Our history brief today returns to today in context and why the U.S. national debt keeps growing. A quick word from our sponsors.
The question isn't whether the world is changing. It's whether you'll be ready for it. At Arizona State University, your education is built around the careers of the future. You learn from renowned faculty and researchers who are driving their fields forward, not just teaching about it. It's why we're ranked number 1 in innovation and number 2 in employability among U.S. public universities. Future-proof your career. Explore more than 350 programs at asuonline.asu.edu. That's a degree better.
This day in history. On June 18, 1812, the United States declared war on Great Britain, beginning the War of 1812. The conflict would test the young republic's independence and shape its national identity. On June 18, 1940, Charles de Gaulle delivered his famous appeal of June 18th from London, urging the French people to continue resisting Nazi Germany despite France's impending defeat. Story of the day. Vasili Arkhipov was born in 1926 in a small village outside of Moscow. He came of age during the Second World War, a formative experience for an entire generation of Soviet officers who understood, in ways that those who had not lived through it sometimes did not, what war actually cost. He joined the Soviet Navy and rose through its ranks with the quiet competence of a man who was genuinely good at his job, without being especially interested in self-promotion. By 1961, he was serving as executive officer aboard a nuclear submarine designated K-19. What happened on that submarine in July of 1961 is a story of its own. One that tested Archipov's courage before anyone had heard of the Cuban Missile Crisis. K-19's reactor cooling system failed. The submarine faced the possibility of a nuclear meltdown. Engineers were sent into the reactor compartment without adequate protection to make emergency repairs. They received lethal doses of radiation, and they died within days. Arkhipov was exposed to significant radiation himself, but he survived, and he remained in the Soviet Navy. And 14 months later, he was aboard submarine B 59 in the Caribbean, in the middle of the most dangerous confrontation of the Cold War. The four Soviet submarines sent to the Caribbean in October of 1962 were part of the Soviet response to the crisis that had erupted when American reconnaissance aircraft photographed Soviet missile installations under construction in Cuba. The submarines, designated B-4, B-36, B-59, and B-130, were each armed with conventional torpedoes and one nuclear torpedo with a yield approximately equal to the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The use of that nuclear torpedo did not require authorization from Moscow. The captain of each submarine had the authority to fire it, but the regulations required agreement from two other senior officers aboard. On B 59, those three men were Captain Valentin Savitsky, political officer Ivan Maslenikov, and Brigade Commander Vasili Arkhipov. All three had to agree. By October 27th, B 59 had been submerged for days and had lost contact with Moscow. The submarine had no way of knowing what was happening on the surface. What was happening on the surface was this: American naval forces had located B 59 and were conducting a practice depth charge exercise, dropping signaling depth charges intended to force the submarine to the surface and identify itself. The Americans believed the Soviets understood that these were signaling charges and not attacks. The Soviets did not understand this. Captain Savitsky believed his submarine was actually under attack. He believed, with the information available to him in that sealed, overheated, oxygen depleted vessel, that war had begun. He wanted to launch the nuclear torpedo before B 59 was destroyed. Political officer Maslenikov agreed. The launch required Archipov's concurrence, but he refused. The accounts of what happened in those hours aboard B 59 are fragmentary, pieced together from the recollections of surviving crew members, from Soviet naval records, and from the work of historians who have spent decades reconstructing the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. What those accounts consistently report is that Arkhipov did not simply say no and leave it at that. He argued and he persuaded. He talked Savitsky down from a decision that, had it been carried out, would almost certainly have triggered nuclear war. An American warship destroyed by a nuclear torpedo in the Caribbean on October 27, 1962, at the precise moment when Kennedy and Khrushchev were engaged in the most delicate back-channel negotiations of the entire crisis, would not have been understood as a rogue act by a submarine out of contact with Moscow. It would have been understood as a Soviet nuclear attack. The American response would almost certainly have been nuclear. What followed from that is not something the human imagination handles well. Arkhipov understood this. Savitsky, in the heat and the darkness of the oxygen depleted air of a submarine he believed was under attack, had temporarily lost sight of it. Arkhipov brought him back. B 59 surfaced. It was met by American warships, and it eventually made its way back to the Soviet Union. The crew was not celebrated. Submarine commanders who had been forced to surface, who had, in the view of the Soviet Naval Command, failed in their mission, were not greeted as heroes at all. Arkhipov continued his naval career quietly. He rose to the rank of vice admiral. He died in 1998. For most of the remaining years of his life, the full story of what had happened aboard B 59 was not publicly known. The details of the nuclear torpedo, the near launch, and Archipov's refusal were classified by the Soviet government and not fully revealed until a conference of former Cold War officials in Havana in 2002, 4 years after his death. His wife Elena learned the full significance of what her husband had done largely from news reports after his death. The scholar and activist Thomas Blanton, who helped organize the 2002 Havana conference, said afterward that the world owes a considerable debt to Vasili Arkhipov. He was describing, with appropriate understatement, one of the most extraordinary individual acts in modern history. On October 27, 1962, a day that American and Soviet leadership later described as the closest the world came to nuclear war, one man on a submarine in the Atlantic was asked to agree to an action that would almost certainly have ended civilization as it then existed. And he said no. The History Brief. The United States currently owes more than $36 trillion. It's a number so large that it's almost impossible to comprehend. And every year, despite political promises from both parties, the national debt continues to climb. So, why does it keep growing? The answer is not found in a single president, a single party, or a single crisis. It's the result of decades of historical decisions that have gradually reshaped how the federal government operates. To understand the debt, we have to start with a very simple idea. The national debt grows whenever the government spends more money than it collects in taxes. That gap is called a deficit. Run enough deficits over enough years, and they actually accumulate into debt. And the United States has been running deficits more often than not for the better part of half a century. But that wasn't always the case. For much of American history, large debts were usually associated with wars. The Revolutionary War created debt, the Civil War created debt, World War II created enormous debt. Then, after the crisis passed, governments typically reduced it over time. Something changed during the late 20th century, however. Beginning in the 1970s and accelerating into the 1980s, the federal government increasingly found itself balancing two competing realities. Americans wanted lower taxes, but they also wanted government programs and services to continue. The result was a growing reliance on borrowing. Then came demographics. Programs like Social Security and Medicare were designed when Americans had shorter life expectancies and a much larger ratio of workers supporting retirees. As the baby boom generation began reaching retirement age, the cost of these programs grew dramatically. This wasn't a surprise. Economists had been warning about it for decades. But politically, reducing benefits or raising taxes proved extraordinarily difficult. Then came the crises. The savings and loan crisis in the 1980s, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the 2008 financial crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic. Each event triggered massive government spending intended to stabilize the economy or address emergencies. And in many cases, borrowing was considered preferable to doing nothing. The 2008 housing crash is especially important here. When the economy entered recession, tax revenues fell sharply while government spending increased. Massive stimulus packages, bank rescues, and economic recovery programs added trillions to the national debt. Then, before the debt could ever stabilize, the pandemic arrived and prompted another unprecedented wave of federal spending. But there's also another factor that's often overlooked, and that's interest. As debt grows, the government must pay interest on that debt. And when interest rates rise, those payments become more expensive. Today, the federal government spends hundreds of billions of dollars annually just servicing existing debt. In some years, interest payments are approaching or exceeding what the government spends on major programs like national defense, which creates a very difficult cycle. More debt leads to more interest payments. More interest payments contribute to larger deficits, and larger deficits create more debt. So, why doesn't Congress simply fix the problem, you may ask? Well, because almost every solution is politically painful. Raise taxes and voters complain. Cut spending and voters complain. Reduce entitlement programs and voters complain. The challenge isn't understanding the problem, it's agreeing on which sacrifices should be made to solve it. And that's what makes the national debt such a powerful example of history in action. It's not the result of one bad decision, it's the accumulation of thousands of decisions made over decades, wars that were fought, programs created, taxes reduced, crises managed, and promises made. In many ways, the national debt is a historical document, a financial record of America's priorities, ambitions, emergencies, and political compromises. And that's why it just keeps growing, because every generation inherits the choices of the one before it, and then adds a few more of their own. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today and helping make this little show such a mighty success. If you're enjoying this show and would like to help with its production, you can always donate a few dollars at buymeacoffee.com or become a Patreon member to enjoy these episodes ad free. Both of those links can be found on our website at www.historyshortspodcast.com. Also, don't forget to check out our YouTube channel where we have different videos and series that are not part of this main feed. Have a great rest of your day, and I will talk to you all again tomorrow.